All right, good morning.
Morning.
Thanks for being out here on Saturday morning, a beautiful Saturday morning. There's a ton of stuff going on today. Let me do a quick introduction. First of all, thank you to Dependable Engines Association for giving me the opportunity to talk to you this morning. My name's Rick Warters. I retired from United Technologies back in 2019 after 35 years. Of that 35 years, 19 was spent at Pratt. I was here during part of the 80s, part of the 90s, part of the aughts, and part of the 10s. And then had corporate responsibility up until my retirement in 2019 for labor relations. So I'm not an engineer, so this will not be a technical discussion, but I'm currently working on a book that's, as I have now found out, is going to be a couple of books about the history that follows Fred Rentschler through the development of the air-cooled engine to the Wasp, and then on to United Aircraft and Transport Company, and then to United Aircraft. So this is going to be, it's been an interesting journey, and the research has been wonderful. And what I'm going to do today is sort of pick up on a presentation I did back in November of last year and give you a bit of the story from the first engine through the first flight. So this is going to be pretty quick, and there'll be time for questions if anybody's got questions after. So let me just jump into it. Okay, just to get us sort of reset here. These are the folks that were involved in kind of the shaping of the first Wasp engine. And what you've got here is you've got Chance Vaught, and that might surprise you that he's involved in shaping the first engine, Admiral Moffett, and Fred Rentschler. So when Rentschler leaves Wright, Chance Vaught is already his buddy, because Chance Vaught was flying Wright engines. He was flying the Wright Hispano-Suiza engine on many of his planes, beginning in World War I and all the way through the early 20s. When the shift happened that the Navy said, we want air-cooled engines, that put Chance in a pickle, because his planes were all built around the Hispano-Suiza, the water-cooled engine. And so he had an issue. But he started, as Rentschler, as president of Wright, started building the J1, then the J2, then the J3, and the J4, which became the Whirlwind. Vaught put those on his planes. So he had that. But he gets to 1924, and Rentschler's got this idea that he's had this problem with the board at Wright. He wants to build a better engine. George Meade has designed the better engine. He's got it all in his head. This guy's a brilliant engineer. And Fred has worked with him now since he first showed up at New Brunswick, New Jersey, back at right after the U.S. entered World War I. And so George has this idea for a better engine. Fred wants to build a better engine, but the board says, we don't want you to build a better engine. We think the easy way in is to buy this company, this engine that Charles Lawrence has, and develop that. And so that's the engine that became the Whirlwind. But Rentschler was not happy. He was not happy with his situation, and he decided to leave. So in September of 1924, Rentschler leaves Wright, and he has a bunch of conversations while he's convalescing from a serious operation. And the folks that he talks to are his buddies from the industry. And so he talks to George Meade, who's there with this idea for the better engine that the two of them have been mulling around for years. And he talks to his buddy Chance Vaught. And he talks to his brother, Gordon Rentschler. Now, Gordon is with National City Bank at the time. And he talks to another family friend, a guy named Colonel Deeds. Deeds ran the procurement of the engine program in World War I. He also started out in Dayton, Ohio. Fascinating guy. And we'll go into that in greater depth at some other time. But what ends up happening is that Fred's got this idea, and he says, you know what? I thought I was going to go back to Hamilton, Ohio and run the family business, but that's not what I want to do. I'm really interested in aviation. Aviation makes me happy. And there's a lot going on in aviation in 1924. It's still early days, but there's a ton going on. And he says, so I want to build that better engine. He makes that decision in concert with these other guys, right? Now, how do you make that happen? He needs the customer. Well, the Navy's been pushing him for this air-cooled engine. Now, this gets presented as chance or coincidence. Chance Vaught goes into Admiral Moffett, and Chance says, my line of airplanes is running really low. I don't have much volume. I need some help. You got to help me. You got to give me some more volume. And the admiral looks at him and he says, Chance, you build us a better plane and we're going to buy a better plane. And he looks back at the admiral and he says, Admiral, you give me a better engine, I'll build you a better plane. Okay? Now, the admiral says, well, what's that look like? And Chance says, it's 350 to 400 horsepower, and it weighs no more than 650 pounds. It's that lightweight, air-cooled radial engine. That's what I want. Now, did Chance just happen upon that? Or was it a conversation with his buddy Fred? Because within a couple of months, Fred walks into the admiral's office and he says, I was thinking about going back to Hamilton and running the family business, but aviation makes me happy. And he says, so I got this idea working with George Meade about building a better engine. And I'm thinking it's like 400 horsepower and it weighs no more than 650 pounds. And what do you think? And the admiral says, Chance Vaught's looking for a better engine. Now, I'm sure the light bulb went on in Fred's head at that point, right? Oh, really? Chance is looking for a better engine? Of course he is, because they're buddies. But the admiral says, okay, we can't give you a contract. You develop the better engine, sort of like what he says to Chance, right? You develop that better engine, and there will be a market for it. And the admiral does something interesting there. He turns it over to this guy, and he says, Gene Wilson, Commander Gene Wilson, is your guy. You talk to him. And he says, Wilson, work with these guys and figure it out. No contract, but you guys figure it out. I put this in here because Wilson and Meade and Rentschler talk a lot through the development of the specs and through the development of the first engine. Now, it should be no coincidence that in 1929, when Wilson retires from the Navy, he goes to run Hamilton and Standard and combine them and eventually run Vought and eventually run United Aircraft during World War II. No coincidence there, right? These relationships are absolutely remarkable. So Admiral Moffett has told Wilson, go figure it out with these guys and tell us what you can do. And so Rentschler comes to Hartford, whole different story. Rentschler comes to Hartford, makes a deal with Pratt Whitney, whereby they're going to put up to $2 million on the table against Rentschler and Meade putting up $500. So it's a great business deal if you can get it. It's pretty remarkable. Now, there's also preferred stock, so they're locked. And in May of 1925, they make the deal with Pratt Whitney. The company is actually formed in July of 25, and in August, 12 guys come to Hartford. Well, the first engine, the last bolt goes into the first engine on December 23rd. Then it sits over the Christmas holiday, and the first engine comes to life in its first run on December 29th of 1925. Now you think about that. This is 7 months since the Pratt & Whitney Machine Tool Company and Pratt & Whitney Aircraft had agreed on a deal. It's 5 months and change since they formed the company, and it's just over 4 months since they actually showed up and had a factory and office space. Unbelievable, right? But they run the engine. This is an amazing thing. Maybe the more amazing thing is that they complete the 50-hour test within a month. Wow. I mean, you think about getting through the test requirements that they've got, and it's pretty remarkable. Now, I will say it wasn't without challenge. They replaced 3 cylinders over the course of the 50 hours and the crankcase. So this wasn't without some issues, but they get it through the process, okay? Now they've got an engine. They've got an engine that runs. Number 1 gets shipped off to the Naval Aircraft Factory for further testing by the Navy. And now they've got this issue. The whole idea for this engine, the specifications for this engine, were all about Chance Vaught's plane. What Vaught wanted to do is he wanted to go from the U-01, which he had been building with the Whirlwind on it. He wanted a bigger observation plane. We later know it as the O-2U, the first Corsair. Okay, that was the idea. That's what the engine was for, but it wasn't ready. And so what do you do? Because we all know, if you work at Pratt, you know that a plane without an engine is a glider, right? But if you're in the Navy, an engine without a plane is an anchor. And that's where they were. So Wilson is tasked with this thing, and Wilson is deeply involved in this program, right? He's been helping set the specs. He's been in regular conversation with Rentschler. He's been out there with his own reputation on the line, saying this new engine is the thing to go, and air-cooled is the way to go forward. This guy's reputation is on the line, and by the way, he's an MIT engineer. He's no slouch himself, okay? So he says, we got to figure this out. And he looks around and he says, you know, there are other air-cooled engines flying. So you got this 200 horsepower Whirlwind, and the ad there that you see is from Wright while Rentschler was still at Wright. Rentschler was still running Wright Aeronautical when they advertised the first air-cooled engines. Rentschler and Meade are deeply involved in the development of the air-cooled industry, not just the Wasp. So we've already got this engine out there. And oh, by the way, Wright has continued even with the departure of some of their best folks. And what they've done is they designed a plane specifically to test their new engine, which is a 350 horsepower engine they call the Simoon. So they've got this plane, and Wilson needs to make a decision. And he says, okay, well, there's this engine flying that's the Wright Simoon. It's an air-cooled engine. It's a 9-cylinder air-cooled radial. It's 360 horsepower. It's 640 pounds, so that's 1.78 pounds per horsepower. But Rentschler's got this engine with him on that's coming in at 425 horsepower, and it's 650 pounds. That's 1.53. I got to see how this thing works. And so he contracts with Chance Vaught, and the bottom of the page down there is from a Vaught invoice, okay? And you can just see it in there. It says, Apache engine install, $4,400. So the Navy turns the Wright Apache over to Vaught and says, make that new Pratt Whitney aircraft engine work on the Apache. They take the Wright engine off, he puts the Pratt Whitney engine on, and we're ready for test. That ends up getting shipped down to Anacostia just outside on the other side of the river in Washington, where they're going to do the first test. And on the way down, this is one of my favorite pictures because it's the only one I know of where you've got on the right there, Rentschler and Chance Vaught together. And their wives, by the way, on the other side. I have yet to identify the naval officer. I'm not sure who he is. But this is Mr. Rentschler's chauffeur-driven car. And they all piled in. So the Rentschlers and the Meades got in the car here in Hartford. They drove down to New York City to Park Avenue, where Chance Vaught lived. And they picked up the Vaught's. They then continue on down to Washington, where they're going to witness the test. Mrs. Meade, in a book about her husband, writes about the test, and she was very disappointed because their child care coverage back here in Connecticut wasn't long enough for her to stay. She ended up having to come back because there were issues with the installation. So it was a good thing Chance was there to make sure the installation got done right. But at the end of the day, the thing gets into the air. And so this is the plane. So we've got this 425 horsepower Pratt & Whitney air-cooled engine. It's coming in at 625 pounds, ready to fly. And this guy, his name is Champion, and he's the pilot. You will see him throughout. You see him in Hartford. You see him all over the place. He was here many times. I mean, like here many times. Plane flies really well, and Wilson in Aviation, the predecessor to Aviation Week, says the Wright Apache has exceeded the high speed of the present standard water-cooled pursuit planes. Its climb in 10 minutes was better than that of standard machines fitted with water-cooled engines by more than 60%. And I love Aviation's next statement. It is believed that the Wasp engine has set an entirely new standard for radial engine efficiency. Forget about that Wright stuff. These guys have built the better engine. George Meade's better engine has come to life on this Wright Apache. Think about that. Rentschler leaves Wright, develops the new engine that Wright wouldn't let him build, and now his new, better engine is flying on the front of a Wright-designed airplane. Pretty interesting stuff to me. The summer goes on, and there are two other applications that happen. One is a Boeing fighter, and the other is a Curtiss Hawk. And while all that is happening, they're also preparing this Wright flyer to get out there and run in the national air races. So the national air races are held down in Philadelphia in 1926, and Champion's going to fly the Apache, which he does. And at the end of the day, you look at this and you say, okay, he comes in at the end of the flight at 168.825 miles an hour. And you look at the rest of that and you say, oh, he didn't win, right? The underdog's supposed to win. That makes the story way better. And Champ didn't win. Well, his first couple of laps were at 173 miles an hour, which put him right up at the top, up near the top, right? And then he cut the corner, and so he was disqualified. All right, but the important thing is the Wasp performed. And this was its first big public outing. The Wasp performed. And the other thing that's interesting is look at the rest of the engines on there. 600 horsepower, 500 horsepower, 440 horsepower. And there were two things that they were worried about, right? One was, could a radial air-cooled engine stand the stresses of the propeller at high revolutions? And the second was head resistance. They thought there would be so much wind resistance going across the radial that the plane wouldn't be able to fly as fast as the water-cooled engines. That's the only air-cooled radial engine in the bunch, and it did just fine. So they did, this really sets them off. There was one other plane that was supposed to fly. It was supposed to fly as a float plane. The problem was that Lieutenant Ofsty put it in the river on his approach to Anacostia. That plane did not fly in the races because it was at the bottom of the river. They did eventually fish it out. They dried out the engine and they ran it again. So that continued to fly. The interesting thing here to me, this picture on the very top is from August when actually Champion brought it in. He set a new record from Mitchell Field on Long Island to Hartford and flew the plane in for a gathering of Pratt Whitney employees, including George Meade, who is just left of center, and Don Brown, who is just right of center in this picture. So the Boeing aircraft flew, did fine, wasn't a world beater, ends up being a good derivative aircraft later. There are going to be a ton of Boeing fighters flying with Pratt & Whitney engines in them in the years to come, just not this one. The other one that was out there was the Curtiss Hawk. Curtiss Hawk did very well with the air-cooled engine. You could buy it, you could get it with a water-cooled V12, or you could get it with an air-cooled Wasp. This one, sort of on its first outing, the name it made for itself was flying cross-country and back with no mechanical issues. This is 1926. This isn't 2026, right? We expect that. We don't expect a plane to need much work. Back then, that was a really big deal. The dependable engine of Pratt & Whitney's dependable engines is starting to really rear its pretty head. Sort of the end of this story, as I'll tell you, the end of 1926 is the big thing that sort of kicks everything off. Up until now, Pratt's made a dozen engines, and that's it. All essentially experimental, all to prove the concept. But we get to October, and Rentschler is signing off on a contract for 200 engines that are going to go into Boeing aircrafts. They're going to go into the Hawk, the Curtiss Hawk, and that lone Apache continues to be a test bed for the company for years to come. But this contract is what sets it out. It's the biggest contract for engines ever awarded. It's over $2 million, so think about that. Pratt & Whitney Machine Tool Company had said, we'll give you up to $2 million. Here's an engine award for $2 million, their first production contract out of the chute. The one interesting thing that I've sort of stumbled across about this picture is that this is shipping, and it's engine number 2, and it's being shipped to Boeing, so it's production engine number 2, being shipped to Boeing, being expressed, and Boeing was pulling hard to get this out there. Rentschler couldn't quite figure out why. Well, the nation had just announced that they were going to open up the airmail contract from Chicago to San Francisco. And Boeing wanted to bid on it. He didn't yet have a plane that he knew could take that route the way he wanted it, and he wanted to try the Pratt & Whitney engine on that. Number 2, production engine, went to Boeing for specifically that purpose. And a couple months later, Boeing was back here negotiating with Rentschler for engines for his airmail plane. But I haven't talked about one thing. Because I started out and I said Chance Vaught was involved in this whole thing, and Chance Vaught's plane was the one that was supposed to fly first. Well, where the hell is Chance Vaught's plane? In November, now mind you, it's flown on the Apache, it's flown on the Boeing, it's flown on the Curtiss, all by July. The plane that the engine was really built, intended for, doesn't end up with a Pratt engine in it, with any engine in it, until November. The O2U, this is a plane. Vaught is a really good designer. He is very deliberate. So I would tell you that Fred Rentschler was deliberate in every thought that he ever had. Chance Vaught was deliberate about every bit of ink that was laid down on a piece of paper. I believe part of that goes back to his early training. He flew, he saw his comrades die in Chicago and in some other places when he was out flying the circuit. He wasn't going to let that happen. These planes were described as some of the best handling planes, or some of the most stable planes that you could ever fly because of the thought process that he put into it, the work that he put into it. He labored over every plane that went out of his shop, to the extent that there are stories of him sleeping in the aircraft. I mean, that's how committed he was to making sure the thing was good. So the O2U finally does fly. And if you take a look at what happens over the course of the next year, what we see are all of these records coming in with the Pratt Whitney engine, right? So the record for altitude for all planes happens in what? That Wright Apache, 38,000 feet. For all seaplanes, again, the Wright Apache, this time with pontoons fitted on it, 38,000 feet. For a speed over 1,000 kilometers, so over 600 miles, the Vought Corsair, right? 131 miles an hour. And then for seaplanes, the records continue to rack up. And these are the things that people are paying attention to. They see that big 200 airplane order. They see all of these different installations that are out there, and they see the records rolling in. And that's when you know you can invest in that dependable engine. And that's what I've got on this piece of the story. There is a lot more out there. So thank you.